32nd year for the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. Thanks so much for coming this evening. This evening's program is normally the January we dedicate to either a German or a Russian topic. This evening, we're very lucky to have one of the great historians on his book that Axel mentioned. This is, thank goodness that these guys have given me a little bit of reprieve tonight. Dr. Chris Seimer is going to moderate the program. I'm going to get a chance to sit down. And Chris was a student of Harold Deutsch's at the University of Minnesota. He teaches at River Falls, and I'm so thrilled to have you here this evening. Dr. Chris Seimer.
We're privileged tonight to have Dr. Jeffrey McGargy, who received his doctorate in military history from Ohio State University in 1998. He is the recipient of a Fulbright grant for research in Germany, from which he wrote Inside Hitler's High Command, which won the Society for Military History's 2001 Distinguished Book Award. He is also the author of War of Annihilation, Combat and Genocide on the Eastern Front, 1941. Dr. McGargy is Senior Applied Research Scholar at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, where he is the project leader and editor-in-chief for the museum's 7-volume Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, 1933 to 1945, the first 3 volumes of which have been completed and are out. The first volume won a National Jewish Book Award and the Association of Jewish Libraries Judaica Reference Award, among other distinctions. Dr. McGargy is a member of the Department of the Army Historical Advisory Subcommittee and has been a presidential counselor at the National World War II Museum and a trustee for the Society of Military History. He lectures frequently on the Nazi camp system, the German military, and the Second World War. We are privileged to have him speak here tonight, and here he is, Dr. McGargy.
Chris, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I always think it's wonderful to get an introduction that your father will appreciate and your mother will believe. My purpose tonight is to, I want to start by thanking you all. This is a wonderful turnout. Really, really pleased to see that this many people are interested in this topic. I hope you still are in another 40 minutes or so. I'm going to give you an overview of some of the ways in which the German High Command, the German General Staff, were not all that they're cracked up to be. I know that the official title of this talk is What Made the Nazi Military Work. This is going to be a lot about how it didn't work, but it'll give you a good chunk, I think, of understanding what happened at that time. I've got about 40 or 45 minutes worth of material here. Then we're going to have Dr. Connie Harris come up, and she's going to make a presentation, and at some point we're going to have a panel here to answer your questions. All right, let's see if we can get this up. All right, there's our intro slide. So we're going to start by talking about the image of the German General Staff. I know a lot of you have heard the phrase and heard of the organization. What is it that we think about when we think of the German General Staff? Well, we tend to think of it as an independent organization, that is, one that is trained to use initiative and speak their minds to power, especially when the pressure's on. We think of it as organized and centralized, a functional bureaucracy with clearly defined spheres of authority and lines of command. We think of it as expert. It certainly thought of itself as expert, tactically, operationally, and strategically gifted. We think of it as anti-Nazi. We were just following orders. Yeah, we didn't really like that little Austrian corporal anyway. Now, in the past, I've considered skipping that last point, but the fact is that too many military historians have done just that. Hitler's politics and the military course of the war were very tightly linked, and we need to pay attention to that. The main point of the myth that grew up around the General Staff after the war, with the active participation of many former German officers, was that Germany entered and then lost the war and committed horrible crimes along the way because of Hitler and a small clique of yes men around him, and despite the best efforts of the General Staff. So what was the reality? Well, the General Staff did demonstrate some strengths, some great strengths in some spheres, but it also suffered from structural, cultural, and intellectual weaknesses that severely inhibited its performance and contributed to the onset, the nature, and the ultimate loss of the war. I'll just make a couple of asides here. First, this breakdown into structural, cultural, and intellectual elements is somewhat artificial, I admit. Each of these overlapped with the others, they affected the others, but I've broken them down this way because I think it helps to clarify some of the things that went on. It helps with the analysis. Second, you've already heard me use the terms High Command and General Staff almost interchangeably. The former is the broader term. The High Command encompassed the General Staff. The General Staff actually was two things. It was an organizational element within the Army High Command, the OKH, and it was also an elite subgroup within the German Officer Corps, the Army Officer Corps, that held most of the key command and staff positions. So in that sense, as an elite part of the Officer Corps, the General Staff dominated the High Command. All right, so let's look at the High Command's strengths and weaknesses more closely, starting with structural issues. There we go. I think I'll leave the remote alone. Much to my surprise, when I started studying this organization, it turns out that the organization of the High Command was not nearly so clear or rational as most people assume. At the lower levels, that is, within the organizational element that was the General Staff, and in the lower headquarters, the organization was not bad. I mean, the Germans had practically invented the General Staff model in the 19th century anyway. And the staffs were logically organized according to function. Their structure would be familiar to anyone here who has worked within a military staff. They were small, which allowed for ease of tactical and operational coordination and control. But we'll talk a bit later about them being too small, in fact, in the intelligence and logistics areas, where size is needed in order to process a lot of information and carry out complex tasks. And there was a long-standing problem above those levels, at the top of the command organization, where you had competing agencies, personal rivalries, and overlapping spheres of authority. I'll illustrate this by talking a bit about the organizational debate that took place between 1933 and 1938. There was basic agreement among German army officers that in World War I, the High Command had not been centralized enough. And so there was agreement that in the next war, the war that they knew was coming, and I'll talk about that a bit too, there needed to be more centralized control. That was pretty much where agreement ended, because beyond that, everybody wanted to be in charge. Now I'll point out a few things here. You had, oh wait, next slide, hang on. Everybody wanted to be in charge, and they wanted to be in charge of operations, that is, planning the great campaigns. They all wanted to be the great commander out in the field directing the armies. You know, if you think of it in American World War II terms, they wanted to be Patton, not Eisenhower, certainly not Marshall. You know, those kinds of functions really weren't of great interest. High-level defense policy, logistics, all that kind of thing, that was all boring. Also, this was largely an internal Army debate. The people who occupied the different positions were all Army officers, and they were arguing among themselves. So now you'll get to see what I'm talking about in organizational terms here. We have the head of state, of course, which is Adolf Hitler. We have the Minister of War, von Blomberg, who's a serving Army general, and he is officially the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. He's assisted by his staff in the War Ministry. Then you have now I'm leaving out the other services, but you have the Army Commander-in-Chief, von Fritsch, and he's assisted by the General Staff, and he commands the different district commands within Germany. This is the peacetime setup. So what you have in this debate is you have Blomberg and the War Ministry saying, we need a centralized command, and we need to be in charge. We will issue orders to the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. And you have the Army Commander-in-Chief, von Fritsch, assisted by the Chief of the General Staff, saying, we have the expertise, we know what we're doing, we need to issue orders to the Navy and the Air Force, and we'll take care of the Army ourselves, and you can go bother yourself with, accounting and things like that. So they went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth about this throughout these years. Really, in one sense, though, it was an exercise in futility, because there was far too much opposition outside of the Army to any centralized, powerful Army command. The Air Force under Goering, the Navy under Raeder, the SA under Röhm while he was around, the SS under Himmler, a growing power, and Hitler himself. None of these people wanted the Army to take on an especially powerful position and be able to run things on its own. So there was really too much opposition to any of the Army's plans for them to come to fruition. So what you have is, in February of 1938, after 5 years of mostly futile debate and bureaucratic struggle among the top elements in the Army, Hitler imposes a solution. Now, I haven't got time to go into it, but there was a huge scandal at this time in February of 38. Blomberg and Fritsch are kicked out of their positions. And the first thing Hitler does is he decides to take personal command of the armed forces himself. So he's eliminated the defense minister job. He sets up the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the high command of the armed forces, to assist him as the commander-in-chief. And he now exercises direct command over the three services. The commander-in-chief of the Army, now von Brauchitsch, is assisted by the General Staff, and this is now the wartime organization. They're commanding the Army groups. So this is the way it was set up at the beginning. It's the way it pretty much worked for Poland. But one important factor here is that the OKW was never set up to really be a headquarters over the three services. The three services maintained far too much independent power, and the OKW was too small, and Hitler never really let it exercise any independence anyway. So this was not something like the Joint Chiefs that we developed. There was no system, such as the British and the Americans developed, for the comprehensive and careful consideration of strategic alternatives by both civilian and military authorities. If the Germans had taken this system and developed it further, they could have had something that might have worked rationally. But instead, the system degenerated further. And I'm going to take you through a series of organizational charts here, about 4 or 5 of them, to show you what happened. I mean, you wind up with a different kind of structure for several different phases of the war. Okay, this is what happens in the winter and the spring of 1940. You have the Army, which is planning for the invasion of France and the Low Countries. Oops, I got out of place. Anyway, and it's focusing on that. And then very much at the last minute, Hitler decides that he wants to invade Norway and Denmark as well, and he gives that task to the OKW, which isn't supposed to be involved in that kind of planning at all. The OKW actually had to pull a headquarters staff in to do the planning for the operation, and the Army was busy raising its eyebrows. The Chief of the General Staff, Halder, is saying, what on earth is going on here? We're supposed to be doing that kind of stuff. But that's the way it worked for that operation. Then we have Operation Sea Lion. Here you have almost no involvement from the OKW at all. You have the Army and the Navy forming their own separate plans that were completely irreconcilable. It's probably just as well that they never had to try and put this in operation, because there was no way you were going to make these two plans agree. And as I say, the OKW is playing no role whatsoever as a coordinating headquarters. Operation Merkur, the invasion of Crete in 1941. Hitler gives the mission to Goering, to the Air Force. And the Air Force now controls Air Force units, which includes the paratroopers who carried out the main assault, but also Army and Navy units, which helps to explain why the Navy's part of this was a complete fiasco, because the Air Force didn't know what it was doing. Again, the OKW plays no role whatsoever. And then, if you want to see a real mess, North Africa. Rommel's in command in this theater. Technically, the theater belongs to the Italians, and the Comando Supremo is supposed to be exercising control. There's a German general with the Italian High Command, a liaison officer. But Rommel, whenever he can, he ignores them. He ignores orders from the OKW. He ignores orders from the OKH, from the General Staff. If he gets into any kind of serious conflict, he goes directly to Hitler. That's what this dotted line is for. He has Hitler's ear, so he's able to maneuver through this system and pretty much do whatever he wants. But as a rational kind of command structure, this doesn't really work very well. What you have develop by the time you get to the spring of 1941 is a fundamental split in the command organization that solidifies by 42, and I'll go into this. As Operation Barbarossa got underway in the summer of 1941, as the planning for it got underway in the spring, the OKW took direct control of all the theaters except a narrow operational zone in the east, where the Army High Command, the OKH, was in charge. Now, this didn't seem like a problem at first. It seemed like a good idea. Operation Barbarossa was a huge endeavor. The Army had a lot on its plate. Let them focus on that. The other theaters were quiet. The OKW can watch over those. Both the Army and the OKW kept track of what was going on in all the theaters, so they were informed. It seemed like a good temporary fix, but the system solidified. And so from October at the latest, October of 42 on, Hitler is commanding in the east through the OKH, through the General Staff, and through the OKW everywhere else. North Africa, the Western Theater, the Southern Theater, Southeast, Norway, Finland, all of those are under the OKW as, in effect, a parallel operational headquarters with the OKH. And there are problems with this. The OKW is much too small to do this. As a matter of fact, that's what these, you see this dotted line going between the General Staff and the OKW. Those are all the parts of the General Staff that deal with logistics and intelligence and personnel and other matters that the OKW doesn't even have staff elements for. So there are parts of the General Staff that have to sort of wear two hats and work for two bosses. Furthermore, as the war becomes more complicated, as things start to heat up in the West and in North Africa, you start to see tremendous battles between the OKW and the OKH over resources. Hitler even complains at one point. He says, no sooner is there a pause in the East than the West is, the OKW is coming to me for more divisions. And no sooner is there a break in the West than the OKH is coming to me for trainloads of munitions. There was no one except for Hitler who could resolve all of these conflicts. And there was no centralized approach to the strategic situation, to logistics, to intelligence, except in the person of Adolf Hitler. Now, the Germans did finally correct this. They finally created a centralized command structure. That was in April of 1945. A bit late. A bit late. I do want to emphasize, these problems didn't lose the war for the Germans. Okay? They contributed. They made things more difficult, but this was not really the main problem. We're going to get to the main problems. So next we're going to talk about cultural issues. Now what I mean here is patterns of behavior, collective needs and ambitions, and fundamental attitudes about war, authority, and staff work. And there are some key elements of that culture. First, there was a long-standing dispute through most of the 19th and into the 20th centuries about what you wanted in an officer. Did you want intellect? Did you want someone who was really smart and educated? Or did you want character, things like courage and strength of will and diligence and those kinds of things? Now, by the time you get to World War II, really the Germans had worked out that they wanted all of that. and their selection and training system really tried to find people who had the maximum in both of those areas. Education and will, if you will. Then there were some command principles that were unique to the German army and very important for the way they operated. The first was command by directive, which sometimes some of you may have heard of as Auftragstaktik. The idea being that you push initiative as far down as you can. The commander says, here's my objective, here are your resources, here are your limits. You design a plan that's going to achieve my objective with what you have. And the next commander down would do the same thing, and this would go all the way down the chain of command. by pushing initiative down, it increased reaction speed, it increased initiative, so it made for a much more flexible military force. Then there was Vollmacht, loosely translated to full authority. This meant that a staff officer, especially a chief of staff, could speak for his commander, could issue orders for his commander. So if a division commander calls up to the Corps headquarters and the Corps commander is off somewhere, the Corps chief of staff could issue an order to the division commander. This is not something you see in our military, trust me. The principle of joint responsibility and the Generalstabsdienstweg, I'll treat these together. Principle of joint responsibility meant that the chief of staff in a headquarters was equally responsible with the commander for every order that went out of that headquarters. Okay. And the Generalstabsdienstweg, which you could call the general staff chain of command, if you will, or chain of communication, this was another interesting element. Best described with an example. If a division commander is about to issue an order that his chief of staff thinks is really stupid, that division chief of staff can call up the Corps chief of staff and say, hey, my commander's about to do something really stupid. If he can convince him, then the Corps chief of staff goes to the Corps commander. And if he can convince him, the Corps commander calls up the division commander and says, hey, listen to your chief of staff. You know, he's got the better idea. This kind of chain of communications, again, is not something that existed in other armies. Now, I'll point out that those last two elements, the principle of joint responsibility and this general staff communications chain, were fading out by World War II. They were created in the 19th century because a lot of senior commanders in those days were noblemen who were appointed to command simply because they were noblemen and they didn't have the precise military education that the general staff had. So you needed some way for the general staff officers to influence them. By World War II, most of the senior commanders, as well as the staff officers, were general staff officers. So you didn't have this kind of conflict. There was supposed to be, when they paired up commanders and chiefs of staff, it was supposed to be like a marriage, presumably a good marriage. They weren't supposed to have a lot of fundamental disagreements. Okay. Other elements. Naturally, as you would expect in any modern military organization, there was obedience to immediate superiors and also to the head of state. There was a lot of reverence for the head of state, hence the loyalty, part of the reason for the loyalty to Hitler. In their approach to warfare, there was a great deal of emphasis on tactics and operational maneuver, that is, the maneuver of large forces in the field on campaign and their engagement in combat. There was emphasis on aggressiveness and initiative. Taking initiative was actually something that they trained their officers to do. They would, in their training, they would put them into an unfamiliar, difficult situation, and those officers were expected to come up with a solution on their own that was innovative and not necessarily a textbook solution, but one that they thought would work. I highly recommend the works of Rob Citino on this, especially his book, The German Way of War, in terms of how the Germans thought in that regard. They believed in war, finally, as an instrument of policy and as a natural state of affairs. Okay, you didn't find a lot of German officers who were going to say, well, war is a last resort, or, you know, we're just here to deter the enemy or something like that. No, they expected to go to war. They expected to be used to achieve aims for the German state. Now, these elements of culture gave the general staff certain strengths. First of all, officers in the general staff constituted an integrated whole. They actually were trained to think in the same way. They were trying to achieve what was called a Gedankengang, a way of thinking, so that they would approach problems in the same way. And officers who weren't even necessarily communicating would know on a sort of fundamental level what the other was going to do, because that was the way that they all approached things. They were less concerned with rank than their counterparts in other armies, which meant that they were willing to speak up to a senior officer. They were encouraged to speak up. Even it was insisted upon, it was expected of them that they would speak up with their opinions. They were able to react and improvise quickly, in part because the staffs were small, in part because they were taught in this common way of thinking. They were expected to be tireless workers. the great von Moltke had a saying, "Gentlemen, there are 24 hours in the day, and if that's not enough, there's the night." And they were quite adept. As any World War II veteran will tell you, they were quite adept at tactics and operational maneuver until the very end. Now, there were also, of course, weaknesses. Germans tended to overestimate the importance of willpower. And this is highly ironic because after the war, they all complained about Hitler and how unrealistic he was, and he never saw the limits that the armies were subject to. This was in part an outgrowth, again, of the First World War. They were determined that there was not going to be a stab in the back on the part of the army. They wanted the army to fight on to the bitter end. It was also an outgrowth of the intellect versus character debate. This is where character comes in. You're supposed to carry on against all odds. They tended to go over their superiors' heads when they disagreed with a decision, and Hitler played on this. If you think again of the American example, if you think of Bradley going over Eisenhower, over Marshall, direct to FDR to complain about something, and FDR accepting that, I mean, we can't see that happening in the American system. But Guderian could go over his army group commander and over the commander-in-chief of the German army and straight to Hitler, and Hitler would sit down with him and hear him out and maybe decide on something that was contrary to what the commander-in-chief wanted to do. So it was an outgrowth, in a sense, of the general staff chain of communication, but it had been twisted. It had been corrupted, if you will. There was also, we've talked about this push for initiative and independence of action, but this was losing out over time to something called the Führerprinzip, that is the leader principle. This was a Nazi party principle, according to which the subordinates' only duty was to obey immediately and without question. Now, in reality, it was more complicated than that, but that was sort of the fundamental principle. And this conflict between initiative and obedience worked its way down through the levels of command as the war went on. More and more officers became willing to micromanage the battle below them, to interfere in their subordinates' spheres, and to report their subordinates if their subordinates failed to obey unquestioningly. German officers were also often too willing to follow an order so long as they could tell themselves that they weren't responsible. Now, this was especially important in what the officer realm. You need to support these SS troops who are coming along behind you and shooting civilians because this is a political order from the Fuhrer, and the officer would say, well, it's not my concern. I wash my hands of this, not my responsibility, so I'll go along with that. That's a complicated topic, and we might want to get into it in Q&A. And finally, there was too much emphasis on tactics and operations at the expense of subjects like global strategy, logistics, and intelligence. German officers had no real understanding of strategy as we think of it today. In their minds, if you won the campaigns, if you won the battles, the war would take care of itself. There was sort of nothing in between there. No understanding of how to balance ends and means at the strategic level. Okay, we're at war with the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire at the same time. No problem. The commander-in-chief of the army actually said, this was before the war began, but he said, the more enemies, the more honor. Yeah, okay. And in logistics and intelligence, now this is something that anybody who's worked on a staff will pick up on right away. The way the Germans planned their operations was the commander and the chief of staff would decide on the scheme of maneuver. This is where the columns are going to go, this is where we're going to attack, these are our objectives. They would turn to the supply officer. They didn't even use the word logistics until after the war. They used the word supply, which had a much narrower connotation. They turned to the supply officer and they'd say, here's what we're going to do, make sure the supplies get there. They would turn to the intelligence officer and they would say, here's what we're going to do, what's the worst thing the enemy can do to stop this, and we'll prepare to deal with that. Okay? Not the most likely thing, mind you, but the worst thing. But the key here is that they decided what they were going to do, and then they went to their support elements. In the American Army, having served on a staff myself, I can tell you it's very different. The commander and the chief of staff will prepare 3 options for the commander based on the commander's general intent. He'll go to the other staff elements and he'll say, which one of these options can you best support? And they will all brief the commander, and the commander will put this all together and decide on a course of action. So you can see the difference in emphasis here. Now, a lot of times it worked out just fine for the Germans, but in other cases, not so much, and that's what we're going to get into now. How did these weaknesses affect the direction of the war? It's an important point, since it bears so heavily on the myth that Hitler lost the war single-handedly. And here the case of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, is the appropriate example. Okay. Most senior officers shared Hitler's belief that this was going to be a quick campaign. After all, the Wehrmacht had just defeated France, which supposedly had the most powerful army on the continent. The Red Army looked very weak. Germany had beaten Russia in the First World War. So it looked as though this would be an easy affair. But the Germans lacked any firm knowledge of the Soviets' resource base. They misread the Red Army's capabilities and deployment. The German army leaders also knew that they had virtually no reserves of men, equipment, supplies, or transport available, and shortages were going to start to hit them as early as late summer. There was no preparation for a winter campaign because there's not going to be a winter campaign. We will have won by then. The entire campaign was based upon the idea that the Wehrmacht would destroy the Red Army in the Western Soviet Union, that is about 2/3 of the way to Moscow and to the north and south. And at that point, the Soviet political system would collapse, and there would be basically no resistance from then on, that the German army could advance as far as it wanted to in the Soviet Union, basically with no resistance at all. Now, when that failed to happen, especially the failure of the political collapse, the Germans had no alternate plan, and that was going to become a big problem. In fact, during the planning for this operation, the generals reacted to the warnings and obstacles that they ran into with systematic denial. There were more junior officers who said, what if the Soviets don't give up? What if they keep fighting? And these officers were told basically, hush, get with the program, it's going to be a cakewalk. There was a part of the general staff that prepared a study that said, look, out to the east, into Siberia, the Soviets have developed these regions. They have industrial resources out there. They have resources they can draw upon. If they don't give up, we can't advance that far. Again, this was ignored. That study came out after the decision had been made to invade the Soviet Union, so it really didn't have any effect. And here's an amazing part. The Germans knew that they were going to face tremendous logistical difficulties. Their initial estimate for this campaign was that they would do it in 13 weeks, plus a 2-week pause in the middle to rest and refit, around Smolensk or so. In December of 1940, they ran a logistical exercise that established that they could not support a campaign of 15 weeks. So they said, what are we going to do? We'll do it in 13 weeks. We'll do it in 11 weeks. We'll do it in 9 weeks. In March of 1941, the commander-in-chief of the German army, General von Brauchitsch, says it'll be a 6-week campaign with a railroad advance after that. Okay. That was going to be tricky because the Russians didn't even have the same gauge of railway, but anyway. This was how they reacted to the obstacles. They just brushed them aside. Okay. Now it is necessary, more than fair to say, but necessary to say that Hitler was still calling the shots strategically. He was the one who decided that they were going to attack the Soviet Union. But his generals did not oppose him, and through their planning, we can see how weaknesses crept into this plan. All right. Now we'll wind up with intellectual and ideological issues. The 1920s and 1930s were the years in which the most significant ideas took shape within the German military. And here the Germans' experience in World War I and its aftermath, and perhaps more important, their perceptions of those experiences, were decisive. Some fundamental ideas emerged about the reasons for Germany's defeat in the First World War, that were tremendously significant. Now, these are not the only reasons that came up, but they are the main ones. The most important and central idea, and I know most of you have heard this one already, was that the German army didn't lose in the field. It was stabbed in the back by Jews and leftists on the home front who signed a treasonous peace. And there were some subsidiary beliefs that went along with this. They believed that there had been a failure of will on the home front, that the Allied blockade had produced privations, there had been political unrest, all of which was true, but that this had left the population vulnerable to these Jews and leftists and led to this bad end to the war. The generals believed further that the nation had not been sufficiently militarized. I mean, this all ties in. And that military justice had been insufficiently strict, thus allowing for incidents of desertion, avoidance of duty, and outright rebellion. This is why they executed tens of thousands of their own soldiers in World War II. And then there were some corresponding beliefs about the next war. First, that it was inevitable, that it represented the only way for Germany to regain its freedom, its national independence, and its economic and cultural rejuvenation, along with a position of world power. Second, that war would be a total war that would call upon all of Germany's material and human resources and would target all sources of enemy strength. There would be no distinction between civilian and military targets. All means were justified in this fight for Germany's survival. And third, Germany would need an authoritarian government that would militarize and organize society in order to sustain this war effort, while the military controlled operations. Now, these ideas, together with the culture of the officer corps, made the German military the willing tool of National Socialism. And thus the officers were willing to help the National Socialists take power, launch a war of conquest, and assist in the regime's war crimes and crimes against humanity. Whole other lecture there. In the pre-war years, and then increasingly as the war went on, Hitler, his party leaders, and various rabidly Nazi generals ensured, through personnel policies, that Nazism became an ever stronger force within the officer corps and the high command. But even early on, there was never enough anti-Nazi feeling to prevent the Nazis from taking control. So now we can look back at that image that we talked about at first. Was the General Staff independent? Well, they liked to think of themselves that way, but in the end they obeyed, often out of enthusiasm, sometimes from a sense of duty, but they obeyed. Was it expert? Within certain realms, certainly, especially in tactics and operational maneuver. But in other areas it did no better than Hitler, and sometimes it did worse, even in areas that it was supposed to be expert in. Was it organized? At the lower levels, yes, but the top was a shambles, in part due to Hitler's meddling, but in part due to organizational squabbles that had a long institutional history. Was it anti-Nazi? Certainly not. The General Staff as a body supported the Nazi Party early on and maintained their loyalty right through to the bitter end, even to the point of genocide. And I'll wind this up with one statistic. The Germans lost about 5.7 million combat fatalities in the Second World War. Of those, they lost more than 1.4 million. That is over 25% of their total between January and May of 1945. Okay. That is the ultimate testimony to the bankruptcy of their command system and their strategy. I thank you very much for your attention. At this point, we're going to have Connie Harris come up, I think, yes? And she's going to make a presentation, and then we will take your questions. Thank you.
I often speak on Harold Deutsch and his experiences before and during the war. And tonight is no different. I will probably fill in some of the things that Jeff has already talked about. Dr. Harold C. Deutsch, as most of you know, was not only a popular professor at the University of Minnesota, but during the war he was a member of the Research and Analysis Division of the OSS, and at the end of the war, he was loaned out to the State Department to interrogate German leaders at Nuremberg. Deutsch was uniquely qualified for this since he was fluent in German and had conducted interviews of German leaders during his sabbatical research trips in Germany during 1936 and 1938. Some of the people he interviewed at Nuremberg are well known, and some of them have already been mentioned this evening. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, he was the chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, from February 1938 to the war's end. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, the chief of the OKW's operation offices and operations staff from 1939 to 1945. In addition, Deutsch interviewed staff officers General of Artillery Walter Warlimont, who served as Jodl's deputy chief on the operations staff from August 1935 to September 1944, and General Georg Thomas, former chief of War Economy Office until January 1943, and also General Heinz Guderian. The interrogations Deutsch conducted took place in various locations: Oberursel, the Nuremberg Courthouse, and Falkenstein Hospital. The Special Interrogations Team had set up rules for the conduct of its members. Interrogators were not allowed to call the prisoners by their title, such as Field Marshal or General. An interrogator was prohibited from shaking a prisoner's hand, and no favors were to be done for prisoners, such as providing them with cigarettes, chocolate, or delivering letters to relatives. These rules were not strictly enforced, and Deutsch proceeded to break every one of them. According to Deutsch, these rules set the prisoners up for the perfect interview. Most American interrogators were gruff and condescending. They had no understanding of the German mindset, with its attention to titles and formalities. Deutsch approached these men with this in mind. He would not browbeat them as a lawyer would do. He was just a historian, just interested in their wartime experiences. His manner made them more willing to speak to him. His focus during his interviews was on German foreign policy. He did not present himself as a member of the prosecution, but just as a historian interested in getting the facts straight, which made them less hesitant to speak with him. And again, his fluency in German did not hurt matters either. These interrogations, or what Deutsch actually would call later on interviews, were, oops, got lost here. So the first person he spoke to was, oops, these two gentlemen, Alfred Jodl and Wilhelm Keitel. He met with Jodl and Keitel together in October 1945 so they could corroborate each other's story. When the prisoners were brought in, Deutsch addressed Jodl in perfect German. As Deutsch related to me in an interview, he began the meeting that day. "Good morning, Herr Field Marshal. I am delighted to meet you. I'm sorry we haven't met before. I'm especially interested in some of the information you know on General so-and-so." And he said, he had told me, he had interviewed a lot of people during his sabbatical year in 1938. "I've been terribly worried about him and was at his place in 1938 and where I spent a lovely weekend." Compared to the average American interrogator, Deutsch said his manner really disarmed Jodl, and to have someone so cordial, and Jodl was more accommodating from the first word. And as he states, Jodl was a man of great dignity, but Wilhelm Keitel maintained his title of bootlicker supreme. And there seems to be a consensus of Keitel being a bootlicker. While Deutsch's interview of the two men was going on, Jodl sat ramrod straight in a chair while Keitel on a nearby bunk. When the interview concluded, Keitel fawned over Deutsch, saying, "Always at your service, always at your service." Deutsch questioned Jodl about several matters having to do with Hitler's foreign policy, especially regarding relations between the Foreign Office and the OKW. Jodl maintained that there was no real obvious points of friction since Hitler believed in the strict separation between these offices. In addition, Hitler insisted on any major problems would go through him, so there could be little difficulty. Most questions that developed were in the form of prestige questions because Foreign Minister Ribbentrop asserted that army commanders were part of the Foreign Office in occupied areas, and Hitler had to rein in Ribbentrop on this matter. While questioned about military matters, they also brought out the explanation of what happened in 1938, and Jeff mentioned this earlier, the Blumberg-Fritsch cases. Keitel had intimate knowledge of both of the cases of why Blumberg and Fritsch were thrown out of office, because von Blumberg's son married Keitel's daughter, and von Fritsch was a longtime friend. Keitel was reluctant to discuss the matter. However, Deutsch informed him that he knew the basic facts of the cases because of his 1938 travels. Now, Field Marshal Werner von Blumberg, as we've already seen, was the Minister of War. And this is a picture of Blumberg and Fritsch with Hitler. But he made a mistake that cost him his high position. He fell in love. Von Blumberg wished to marry a young woman and asked Keitel for an opinion. Keitel asserted that the army would not object. This is von Blumberg's second marriage, of course. After the marriage, which Keitel did not attend, it was discovered that von Blumberg's young bride had something of a past, meaning that she was a suspected prostitute, which was never proven, but she was a pornographic model. When this was reported to Hitler, von Blumberg was forced to resign. In the case of Baron Werner von Fritsch, the commander-in-chief of the army, he was accused of an offense under paragraph 175 of the Reich Penal Code, being a homosexual. He never married, and so that helped. Hitler asked Keitel, who replaced von Blumberg, what should be done in this case. And there's a whole lot more to this story than I'm going into right now. And in his later work, Hitler's Generals, Deutsch found conclusive evidence that Fritsch was not guilty of the offense. The case against Fritsch actually involved the devious machinations for power penetrated and perpetrated by the cabal of Hermann Goering, Reinhard Heydrich, and Heinrich Himmler, who believed that their forces would gain power at the expense of the German army. Although von Fritsch denied the accusation and later was found not guilty in a court-martial, he was removed from his position and reduced in rank. The removal of von Blumberg and von Fritsch gave Hitler the opportunity to consolidate his hold over the armed forces, replacing these men with Keitel and Walther von Brauchitsch, who did not have the courage to confront Hitler. And indeed, after seeing what happened to their comrades, many of the generals feared the same fate. Many, including Deutsch, believe Jodl should not have been executed for his part in the war. Although Jodl knew and saw too much to be completely innocent, his role had been greatly exaggerated, and if the trial had been held 6 months later, he would not have been executed. Although Deutsch's assessment of Jodl remained unchanged even with his post-war correspondence with Louise Jodl, Jodl's young wife, who was tireless in her attempts to redeem her husband's reputation. And Deutsch said, no, he knew too much. According to Deutsch, one of the most fascinating generals he ever interrogated was this gentleman to the left, Walter Warlimont. He was even more fascinating than Heinz Guderian. Warlimont spoke perfect English and was married to a member of the Anheuser-Busch family, the folks who make Budweiser, folks. Deutsch held 12 meetings with Warlimont at Nuremberg, more than any of his other interrogations. And he covered the war for Deutsch, providing information that would help with his other interrogations, like Jodl and Keitel. Although considered a Nazi general, Warlimont did try to forestall the 1940 Western Offensive. His efforts brought him into contact with the opposition leaders like Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of the Abwehr and General Georg Thomas. Until Hitler's Western Offensive, many military leaders believed that the phony war would be brought to a peaceful conclusion. That's the time period between the invasion of Poland and when they go into France. However, Hitler expressed doubts about Belgian neutrality. The threat to Belgium particularly upset Warlimont because it was his birthplace and he had many friends and relatives there. He decided on two measures that might help prevent the offensive. First, he attempted to compile economic data and the arguments against the campaign through the information from the War Economic Office and the Reich Economic Ministry. Having been a member of the War Economy Office from 1926 to 1936, he went to General Georg Thomas for statistical data, which he promptly received. However, the Reich Economic Ministry would not provide him with information that he needed. Therefore, it was impossible to prove his case. Having failed at this measure, Warlimont attempted to appeal to the Belgian king to mediate between the warring powers. Warlimont was a close friend of the German military attaché in Brussels, a Colonel von Pappenheim, who made visits to Berlin before the offensive and spoke with Warlimont each time. Warlimont informed him of the plans for the violation of Belgium's neutrality, so Pappenheim could make provisions for the safety of his family. The two men were convinced of King Leopold's sincerity in remaining neutral. Pappenheim approached the adjutant to the king, a Lieutenant General Overstraten, and suggested the idea of mediation. Shortly after this, Warlimont heard King Leopold's proposal for mediation, but Great Britain refused to negotiate. His attempt at stopping the Western Offensive in 1940 was the nearest to the opposition Warlimont came. Jodl, Keitel, and Warlimont were the officers under them were never approached about being part of an early conspiracy. Life in prison, Warlimont's sentence was reduced to 18 years, and he was granted amnesty and released in 1957. He spent his remaining years writing his memoirs and died in October of 1976. And he did speak to Deutsch after the war also. He also talked to Georg Thomas. He was not considered a fighting general. He carried on this invisible fight in the Nazi regime. In his official capacity, he advised Reich leaders on the military capabilities to make war. He was an economist. His duties were to study, observe, and evaluate the economic war potential of other countries, and to state the requirements of the armed forces for raw materials, means of production, and labor to the Ministry of Labor. And as you've already seen, the German General Staff, the OKW, and everyone had a little bit of a problem with this. Unofficially, he opposed Hitler's regime from the start. He never wavered in his convictions to purge the Nazi government from power. Deutsch interviewed Thomas at the Falkenstein Hospital because the general was in very bad health, and he ultimately does pass in the early 1946, and discussed his economic observations and his involvement in the opposition efforts. In the spring of 1933, Thomas had been part of a delegation to inspect Soviet industrial installations. Their report stated, in spite of noting some obvious weaknesses, bad communication, lack of skilled workers, lack of industrial experiences, they had been very much impressed with the Soviet economy. They emphasized the size of the Russian food production and the quantity of raw materials and the significance of the developing armament industry. The report concluded that in about a decade, Russia's economic war potential would be so great and so incalculable that in the event of war, it would have looked upon as a great power in economic capabilities. The delegation's report recommended that Germany should adopt a policy that would not bring her into conflict with the Soviet Union. Hitler rejected their conclusions, expressed the opinion that the mission had been deceived by a set of Potemkin villages, and remained determined to combat the Soviets to the utmost. Hitler continued to reject Thomas's warnings about Russia's economic war potential. There we have that little denial piece that Jeff was talking about. Hitler described Thomas's estimates shown to him by Keitel as the silly talk of Jewish and pacifistic agents. During the interview, Thomas described to Deutsch how, from 1936 onward, Hitler expressed his warlike views more openly. Thomas attempted to show the error of the new war through lectures and by publishing contributions to newspapers and military periodicals. Increasingly unpopular in Hitler's inner circle, Thomas gained the reputation as a pessimist and pacifist. By not falling in line with the party line, Thomas should have been removed from his post, but no suitable replacement was presented, and he was not a threat to Hitler's power. Not only did Thomas publish his views, but he also tried to gauge opposition support. In 1938, when Hitler wanted to sever the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, Thomas queried various German business leaders to gain support. Great Britain and France's appeasement at Munich undermined Thomas's efforts, and the same leaders who agreed with him became ardent supporters of Hitler's policy. Thomas believed that the war's end, that Germany's chief soldiers, as well as its business leaders, should be held responsible for the moral cowardice they showed by not supporting his efforts. Following the Sudeten crisis in the summer of 1939, Hitler, as he prepared to attack Poland, Thomas wrote a memorandum which set forth his view that a Polish war would inevitably generate a new world conflict, and this would be a war of material for which the German economy was not prepared. When Thomas presented the memorandum to Keitel, he would not allow Thomas to finish and stated the Führer would never enter another world war. On the Sunday before the outbreak of war, Thomas tried again through statistical estimates of economic potential between Germany and probable enemies to convince Keitel to confront Hitler about the danger of another war. Keitel reacted negatively and again denied the war's possibility. For the next 4 years, Thomas looked for opportunities to overthrow Hitler's government and end the war. He approached the leading field commanders such as General Gunther von Kluge, Major General Erich von Manstein, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, asking them to assume the leadership for such an, but gave one excuse or another for postponing the issue. Only after Stalingrad did he stop approaching other army leaders, not wanting Hitler to be a martyr. During these years, Keitel became increasingly irritated with Thomas and eventually forbade him from submitting comparative economic reports of Germany and its enemies. Thomas incurred the wrath of his superiors through his, as Hitler phrased it, overly objective economic surveys, and was ejected from the OKW in January 1943. While opposition elements ebbed and flowed with the success of Hitler's plans, Thomas stood by his deeply rooted Christian convictions, believing the government was immoral to the core. Thomas played no role in the July 20th, 1944 attempt to assassinate Hitler. Because of his Christian beliefs, he disapproved of assassination, which caused his separation from this conspiracy. After the war, Thomas was not tried at Nuremberg, and again, like I mentioned, he died in 1946. Finally, we have a gentleman a lot of people know about, and that's Heinz Guderian. Unlike Heinz Guderian, of course, as most of you know, was a fighting general in every sense of the term. He was considered one of the innovators of tank warfare and he was familiar with life in the field. This knowledge and his concern for his men caused several clashes with Hitler, which led to Guderian's dismissal for a time. Deutsch interrogated Guderian, and his first impressions prove interesting. As he stated, "I got to the prison at Oberursel at 8 a.m., as I usually did. At the interrogation room, he was brought in and sat down. The other interrogators would just say, 'Good morning, sir,' as the rules said, but I ignored them. 'Herr General,' he was never a field marshal, 'how are things for you in prison?' He broke down in tears. He told me he was having a disgraceful time and they were not mistreating him physically, but next to that, they were not continuing his special hard diet that he was supposed to have. Also, they had worked on his teeth with fillings and such and had stopped right in the middle, and this caused him pain. The guards were American paratroopers who had been in Berlin. They had been informed that they were not going home, but sent here to this godforsaken place where they were interrogating German prisoners, who they assumed would be war criminals. So when he, Guderian, was taken to the washroom, the guard would make him running up behind saying, 'Hurry up, you goddamn Nazi,' or something like that. In that and other ways, they would verbally abuse him. I told him I was highly ashamed as an American to see this go on, and I would make sure it was finished right then and there." While Deutsch asked Guderian to describe his role in the latter part of the war, the general felt the need to clarify his lack of open action against Hitler, as well as review his activities throughout the period. Much in the Nazi regime, Guderian regarded as undignified and indecent, but it did a lot to improve conditions in Germany in the early 30s. Guderian believed that the army would be a moderating influence over the Nazi extremes, but the opposite happened as the army became weaker over time. This became particularly clear at the time of the removal of Blumberg and Fritsch, which was a disgraceful episode from every standpoint. On that occasion, Guderian felt the army chiefs should have threatened a mass resignation if Hitler persisted. When war came, the army's position was seriously weakened. Deutsch was particularly interested in Guderian's experience on the Eastern Front. Guderian believed Hitler had been briefed on Soviet resources, and before the war, Guderian himself prepared a book on tank warfare. In that work, Guderian had spoken with considerable respect of the Russian tank position and had made an estimate of an establishment of 10,000 modern tanks. Actually, Guderian said that the Russians had 17,000 tanks, but some of these naturally were outdated models. Hitler believed this to be a ridiculously high estimate. It became obvious to Guderian that Hitler would not accept unpleasant facts about the war potential of those with whom he was or might subsequently be at war. And Jeff sort of backed that up again earlier also. Guderian told Deutsch that he had met with the head of the Army Group B, Field Marshal von Bock, and agreed that continuing the 1941 offensive on Moscow was insane. They decided to call up von Brauchitsch at the Wolfslayer in East Prussia, and both of them gave him everything they could by way of an argument on the phone. Hardly able to get a word in, von Brauchitsch agreed with them, but said, "The Fuhrer is determined to do this. There is nothing we can do to stop it. We should just try as best we can to follow through with it." Later on, when the autumn offensive was to start on the 4th of December 1941, the temperature was a minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit. The gas situation was dire, and nothing started. Tanks were rolled over holes, dynamited in the ground, which were filled with gasoline, then lit so the tanks could be warmed up. The tanks ran on diesel, which doesn't do well in minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit. 2 days into the offensive, things just froze. Guderian sent orders to stop and informed headquarters of his decision. The men were so cold they stood there and just said, "Just shoot us, we can't do any more." 6 days later, Guderian was called into the headquarters at the Wolfslayer. Hitler ranted at him that he should have had enough drive and will to manage it. Guderian brought up the matters of the weather and the transport, but Hitler shoved them aside. At one point, when the general described the suffering of his troops, Hitler yelled at him, "Sie haben zu viel Mitleid mit der Truppen. Guderian, you have too much mercy for the troops." A couple days after this, Guderian fought with the man who succeeded von Bock in Army Group B, von Klug, who then recommended Guderian's removal to Hitler. Hitler, already upset with Guderian, accepted it, and the general took no part in the war for 14 months. In the meantime, Guderian believed that the whole German tank corps had gone to hell. When they called him back to be the inspector general of tanks, he had to put it back into shape. Among the favors, and Deutsch did several favors for Guderian, was one on a lovely day in August 1945. They spent the day driving around Taunus, an area 15 miles northeast of Frankfurt, and he was in seventh heaven. That is one of those times I wish I'd asked Dr. Deutsch, what did you two talk about? But I never followed up that question. It's been one of my deep regrets over whenever I studied Deutsch. In addition, Deutsch delivered Guderian's first letter to his wife, and that day driving around was the first time Guderian had been out of prison. Although interrogated, Guderian never stood trial as a war criminal, and after the war, he wrote his memoirs and died in 1954. When looking back at this extraordinary historical time, Deutsch posited several judgments and missed opportunities. Because of a family emergency, his wife was quite last weekend of his scheduled interrogations. These four regarding implications on foreign policy. Of course, by the time I was to interview him, I had picked up an awful lot of information about his role in many aspects of the war leadership, and I would have especially liked to. And by the way, this is a cartoon that was done of Deutsch interrogating one of the German generals. These interviews and many others, and provided part of the narrative of his major works, The Conspiracy Against Hitler in the Twilight War, which we have a couple of copies for sale in the bookstore back there, and Hitler and His Generals. In addition, his experiences became part of his classroom lectures at the University of Minnesota and the Army War College, and also, much later, part of the World War II Roundtable. Thank you, and now we will open it up for questions here.
Would you be able to comment on the famous debate in Normandy? Waterline, or wait till the Allies are ashore and then hit them with the Panzers? And why it was such a unresolved issue by that late in the war?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, is this working?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
You might have to repeat part of the question.
Okay. The question has to do with the German defensive concept for Normandy. Rommel, I believe, wanted to meet the Allies right on the waterline and defeat them right there. Rundstedt wanted to maintain a central reserve that he would apply wherever the Allies came ashore, hit them after they came ashore. Debate there was at the time between Rommel and Rundstedt, a lot of argument back and forth, and debate ever since over which was the better course. I don't really see a whole lot of difference, honestly. I mean, Normandy was not a sure thing, but I don't know that. I mean, if they had dedicated all their resources along the coast, they would have been more spread out. On the other hand, by holding some units back, they were more subject to aerial attack as they came forward. I don't see that there was a defensive concept that was a guaranteed winner either. I think it's a toss-up.
But, Jeff, one of the points on this, there was also the controversy of would they be landing at Normandy or would they be landing at Calais, right?
Now, one of my fellow graduate students from long ago wrote a very good article about the fact that the Germans logistically could not have put more forces into Normandy anyway. They couldn't have supported them there. The railroads were being bombed out. The roads were being, interdicted.
What about the role of anti-Semitism in the strategic doctrine? Because in 1941, after the invasion of Crete, the British were able to take the entire Middle East with less than 10,000 troops. They overwhelmed Vichy in Syria. They overwhelmed a coup in Iraq. They took Ethiopia, and at most they had 10,000 troops. Meanwhile, the Germans were massing 3 million troops on the Soviet border. And most people believe that it was because the Germans believed in what they would call the Jewish Bolshevik communist conspiracy, and in the words of Hitler, all you had to do was kick in the door. I believe all of the strategic decisions that the Germans made were based, A, on anti-Semitism, and 2, on the ability of the German elite to loot Jewish assets all over Europe.
Well, what I would say to that is, when we talk about German strategic leadership, that means Hitler, okay? And so, I mean, one of the interesting things that I've learned from reading Jeffrey's book and hearing him speak is the absence of higher level strategic organization or thought in the general staff. So when we talk about German designs, we're talking about Hitler's designs. And Hitler's designs are unequivocal and consistent from the time he wrote Mein Kampf, which is quite correct, as you observe, a war against the colossus of Jewish Soviet Bolshevism and the need to expand for Lebensraum in the East. So, yes, I mean, obviously this informed Hitler's absurd decision to go to war in the first place, and certainly to take up Operation Barbarossa. And the entire conduct of the war in the East was informed by this, as Hitler called it, a Weltanschauungskrieg, a war of the Nazi worldview against what in the Nazi mindset was the greatest enemy, the Soviet Union. So essentially, yes, your analysis is quite correct, that anti-Semitism was the be-all, end-all of Hitler's worldview, to such a degree that even when Russian 152 millimeter shells are landing on the Fuhrer bunker, he takes time out to write his political testament, and he asserts that the enemy of the world is Jewry, and it must be fought. So from beginning to end, this informed his worldview. So yes.
I'll just expand on that a little bit. I mean, Chris is absolutely right that Hitler was the one making the strategic decisions. But here again, as in military matters, the generals were right on board with him. The generals, and I don't know what percentage of Germans, but a large percentage of Germans believed that this was a war against a worldwide Jewish conspiracy. And it was a total war, as I mentioned before, so all means were justified. The generals believed, as did many Germans, that the Jews were behind the whole Bolshevik, the whole communist state. They were the force behind this. And that they were controlling events in the Soviet Union, in Great Britain, in the United States, and this was what Germany was fighting against.
Jeff, Don here, would you also talk about the extent of your research at the Holocaust Museum, the number? I mean, a lot of us have visited maybe 3 or 4 of the concentration camps, but tell about your research and how that's expanded in number.
Okay, briefly. I'm in charge of this 7-volume encyclopedia of camps and ghettos. I've been working on it for a little over 19 years now. And when we started, I was told to expect to cover somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 individual sites. Now, this is all kinds of camps: concentration camps, forced labor camps, POW camps, ghettos, and another 15 or 20 categories that most people have never heard of. As we started to dig, we discovered that in some areas no research had been done. In other areas, research had been done by individual scholars, but they had never talked to each other. Nobody had ever added up the numbers. So the numbers began to rise. At this point, we are trying to cover in the encyclopedia approximately 45,000 individual camps and ghettos. And I will tell you that that is a conservative figure. There are many tens of thousands that, for one reason or another, we can't cover. I think you could double that number and still not be at the absolute maximum. So we're learning a great deal about how the camp system worked within Nazi Germany, how important for the Nazis to try to achieve their fundamental goals for Germany. The camps were tools in this effort. And so those are sort of the broad lessons that we're learning. We have 3 of the volumes out at this point. The 4th one should be out in about a year. And then we have...
Teach high school, I try to do everything I can to counter this tendency, but why are so many millennials, why are so many people under perhaps the age of 40 so appallingly ignorant about the Holocaust and the camps? I mean, there was recent, it was a Jewish organization, I forget the name, that published data recently, did a questionnaire or poll, and it made for frightening reading. It really did, and it made you think about all these platitudes about the never again and all this sort of stuff. When you're coupling that with these vast areas of ignorance, it just strikes me that what are we doing wrong in education? What are our schools doing wrong?
What are we doing right?
Well, no, please tell me. I'd love to know.
I mean, I actually have a hard time answering this simply because I'm sort of on the other side of the perspective. I see a lot of youth groups, school classes, and very engaged young people coming to the museum and learning about this. I'm aware of educational initiatives across the country to teach about the Holocaust. I have a hard time judging how many kids we're reaching. I mean, how many kids are really interested in history anyway? It's sort of a hard thing to judge, but I agree we need to do more. You know, and we need to explore the ways in which the Holocaust is truly relevant. You know, you could almost argue that the Holocaust is so extreme that it makes a bad example. But I think we need to understand what there is about the Holocaust that links it to Cambodia and Rwanda and Bosnia and Darfur and the Rohingya, to all of the genocides that have taken place since then and that are threatening to take place today.
Thoughts on the theory that the British and the Americans fed the Germans misinformation on the strength and intentions of the Soviet Union, which gave them the idea that they could just kick in the door?
Heard any? I have to admit, I've never heard of such efforts. I've never heard those stories. I know that the British and the Americans were busy trying to warn Stalin that the Germans were going to attack, and Stalin studiously ignored them. But I haven't heard about the stories of misinformation going. It wouldn't surprise me. But I think, I mean, from the evidence I've seen, put it this way, the Germans thought they had plenty of information on their own. I didn't see evidence when I was doing my research that they were taking information from questionable sources.
I think the biggest misread on military matters was the German observation of the Soviet performance in the Finnish War, although the Russian, I mean, I think they really paid attention to the opening months of the war with Finland, where the Soviets performed abysmally. And I think that they kind of drew exaggerated conclusions of the weakness of the Soviet Union from that.
But before we move on here, could I see a show of hands of students of Harold Deutsch in the audience? I thought there would be more. I'm sorry?
He taught at the University of Minnesota from 1929 until 1972. And then he spent 14 years at the Army War College and the National War College. And then he returned in the mid-'80s when in '85 when Chris and I were just starting our graduate program, and we met him there, and he taught a seminar, and we were able to take a couple of seminars with him.
First of all, thank you for your work as historians. As the last question just suggested, we need a lot more attention to history. I have two questions. The second one is really simple. The first one is, what can any of you tell us about the success of the resistance within the German general staff? And I'm especially interested in the work of Hans von Dohnanyi. And the second question, he was married to Dietrich Bonhoeffer's sister, and worked, it was in Abwehr, and you probably know his work. And the second question is, has the volume that deals with Sachsenhausen come out yet? Thank you.
Let me just suggest one thing. Back in November, we had a speaker in from Israel, spoke on the plots against Hitler, and Axel has that book out on the counter.
I was guessing that was...
Yeah. Question, go ahead.
I mean, I think we can, in a sense, we can judge the success of the conspirators within the General Staff by the results they achieved. You know, there were a number of plots, and I'll confess up front, I have not made a thorough study of the resistance in Germany. The impression that I have gotten is that a lot of these men, I mean, some of these men were motivated by a fundamental disagreement with Nazism, by a fundamental objection to what Nazism stood for. Others among these men were motivated by the fact that they saw the war being lost. Some of them had even been perpetrators on the Eastern Front, and they didn't really have a problem with that. But when they saw the war going downhill, then they decided, well, we need to get rid of Hitler because that's the only way we're going to win this war. And then you have other folks who never really were all that interested in resistance at all, but pretended to be so after the fact. We can talk about Guderian sometime if you want.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, your second, the volume having to do with Sachsenhausen.
Yes.
The volumes are organized according to type of camp. And the first volume has to do with the so-called early camps and the SS concentration camps and their subcamps. So Sachsenhausen is in there. And I'll point out that the first two volumes of the encyclopedia are available on the museum website free of charge. You can download them as PDFs. We've worked out an agreement with the publisher where 3 years after the hard copy comes out, we can release the text as a PDF.
To ask you about the participation of the German, the participation of the German armed forces in the Holocaust. You know, irrespective of the Einsatzgruppen or the Waffen-SS, how dirty were the hands of the German army and other military forces in the extermination of Jews and also killing other unarmed civilians?
They were in it up to their eyebrows. There was an agreement formed in the spring of 1941 between the Army and the SS for the use of the Einsatzgruppen. The Army knew exactly, the Army's representative was General Wagner, he was the head of the Army Logistics Organization. They knew exactly what these Einsatzgruppen were for. Einsatzgruppen had been used in Poland already, and there had been some Army objections to that, not really on moral grounds, but on disciplinary grounds. So the generals who were involved knew what the Einsatzgruppen were for. The agreement had the Army providing transportation, ammunition, supplies, housing, and movement orders for those groups. In addition, Army units often cordoned off the execution sites, helped to round up the Jews, formed ghettos where ghettos were formed in the Soviet Union, and there were Army units that took part in shootings directly. Army units also benefited from Jewish ghetto and camp labor. They organized, they were instrumental in the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs, many of them for the fact that they were Jewish. So they were, and there were orders that went out, as a matter of fact. I'll just note this one last point. In October and November of 1941, one of the generals on the Eastern Front, Reinhardt, I think, issued an order that covered a lot of different points about German occupation policy and relations with Soviet civilians. And one of the points that he said was, you have to show understanding for the harsh but just retribution against the Jewish subhumans. This order went to all of his, he was an army commander. It went to his, he was an army group commander. It went to his subordinate armies. It also went up the chain. Hitler liked it. It went out to the rest of the army group commanders and on down through the rest of the army. So this was an indication of the extent to which the high command and going down through the officer ranks was on board with this and other policies that resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people, millions of Jews and millions more non-Jewish Soviet and Polish and other civilians.
Who you thought was the best of the German generals and why?
Was there one who didn't fight? I'm sorry, the question was what do I think was the best of the German generals? And I'll open this up to you too. I mean, I would preface this by saying that none of them was very good above the operational level of war. That is, campaigns, figuring out where to send the tanks, attacking and surrounding the enemy, that sort of thing. And many of them were very good at that. Manstein, Guderian, many of them had those kinds of skills. None of them was very good above that. Beck, who of course was Army, he was the chief of the General Staff until 38, October or so of 38, at which point he left the Army. He had perhaps the most realistic understanding of where this war was going to lead. He was all for it once the Wehrmacht was ready, but he didn't think the Wehrmacht was ready yet. So I guess you could argue that perhaps he was the best of the generals. But yeah, I don't have a very high opinion of any of them, frankly.
Did the 45,000 camps, did they tax the war effort? Did they hinder it? Second part was, did the Soviets have any qualms? Did they want to damage or hurt the Germans before 36 or 38 when Soviets were attacked?
Okay. On the question of whether or not the camps may have hindered or helped the German war effort, they certainly helped it from the standpoint of providing labor. Germany had a huge labor shortage because most of the young men were off fighting the war. And by 1944, about 20 or 25% of the German labor force was forced laborers from other places. So there was definitely some economic benefit. Now, I have heard the question raised, why did the Germans waste so many resources killing the Jews when they had a war to fight, taking them by train everywhere and setting up these camps and that sort of thing. And there are sort of two answers to that. The less important answer is that it didn't really take that much in the way of resources to carry out the final solution. Not nearly so much as most people would assume. There were many, many times more trains crossing Germany carrying coal every day than there were carrying Jews. But the more important question here, or the more important point here, is that it's that particular question misses the point. Eliminating the Jews was a war aim for Germany. As I mentioned earlier, this was not a distraction for them. This was not something that took away from their war effort. This was one of the main reasons they were fighting the war. And I'm sorry, repeat your second question?
The Soviets, did they have any qualms with Germany?
Oh, did the Soviets have problems with Germany before the war? On an ideological level, yes. I don't know Soviet history as well as I know German. Ultimately, the Soviet goal was to overcome the rest of the world. Capitalism. He was actually He bent over backwards to try to maintain peace with Hitler, starting with the Non-Aggression Pact in August of 1939, and was, by all accounts, extremely surprised when the Germans turned on him in 41.
So you've debunked several of the assumptions about the German high command over the course of the war and their perceived strengths that many people have believed over the years. And I was just wondering if, like, sort of on the other side of the coin, are there perceived weaknesses of the other Axis high command, such as the Italians, the Finns, the Romanians, that are actually better than are remembered in the public knowledge?
There I have to plead ignorance. I haven't studied the other high commands. I know a little bit about the Italian armed forces, but just enough to be dangerous. I wouldn't really be able, just enough to be dangerous. I wouldn't really be able to give you a reliable answer.
When Hitler decided to declare war on the United States, even though Japan would have been the focus of the United States, did anybody come to a conclusion of why he did it within the high command? Anybody try to talk him out of it or into it? And what did he think the results were? Because there was no way they had bombers or the Navy even to get to New York or to Washington.
Yeah, there's an excellent book on this called Tomorrow the World. The author's name escapes me at the moment, but I mean, basically what happened, and in 1940 and increasingly through 1941, as the United States is becoming more and more obviously not neutral, supporting the Allies, Hitler is thinking about, for example, as bases from which to launch further actions. And when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, he figures, well, yes, my alliance with Japan is defensive. I'm not obligated to go into this fight. But I'm going to have to fight the United States sooner or later anyway. The only thing I really lack is a navy. Japan's got that. Japan is going to keep the United States tied up. So this is a good time to jump in with both feet. I don't think anybody knows his thinking any better than that. He didn't write it down. He didn't explain it anywhere. But one other interesting element of this is that for the German generals, this barely elicited any attention at all. First of all, they all had to gather around a map to try and figure out where Pearl Harbor was. But then the consensus, and this is one of those weird departures from reality that is difficult to explain. Most of the German generals didn't think that the United States had done very much in World War I, and they didn't think that the United States would be able to do very much in World War II. The Navy, the German Navy, was champing at the bit, saying, just let our submarines go at those convoys, and we'll no American soldier will ever set foot in Europe. So they figured. I mean, General Halder, the chief of the General Staff. Now, granted, he's quite busy with the Eastern Front at that point, but he's keeping a war diary. He barely mentions the entry of the United States into the war. It's just not a big factor.
I'm 25 years old, and just one thing to help teachers and other people who are interested in helping young people know more is one thing that's really brought the Holocaust home to me is reading about Sonderkommando, the Jews who are in the camps who are forced to do a lot of the dirty work for the Nazis. And there's some good books. And there's also paintings by David Olaire, who was a Jewish man, and he painted his experience. And so that can really bring that experience home for young people. But my question is, where do you think the root of German anti-Semitism came from? I've looked at Karl Marx wrote this essay on the Jewish question. Did that come into the Nazi Party through Otto and Gregor Strasser? Was it because of, Nietzsche talked about Judaism as slave morality and Hitler kind of bastardized that? Was it because of, American eugenics? Where was it from?
Does either of you want to take a crack at it?
Give it a shot.
Where do you go to school?
How many hours do we have to answer that question?
Yeah, books have been written.
Maybe that's another program.
Well, in a nutshell, this is a highly controversial topic and an important topic. But what you start to see in European thought in the late 19th century is the development of what was called social Darwinism. And this is a kind of distortion of Darwin and various other mega theories that were popular at the time. But you began to have the belief that there were hierarchies. One of the things that was turning everybody on in biology was categorizing every species and subspecies and things like this. Well, you start having racialist thinkers that start categorizing human beings according to a hierarchy, and this gets conflated with the idea of a hierarchy of value. And then I've made a study of these racialist thinkers, and by an odd coincidence, they all seem to find that English racialists consider the Anglo-Saxons to be the summit of humanity. French racialists consider, of course, the Gallic race to be superior. And German thinkers somehow came up with the Germans as the acme of human development, etc., etc. But these ideas then got conflated also with a belief that, and this was, taking a page from Marx, as you mentioned, Marx saw all history as class warfare and resolved through violent means. Racialist theorists saw all history as racial struggle resolved through violent means. And it was this kind of murky type of thinking that we know Hitler was exposed to when he was a derelict on the streets of Vienna. But he was by no means the only person involved with what was called the Völkisch Aryan-sophist beliefs, that this was the root, this was the secret of history, just as Marx's followers believed that historical dialecticism and the inevitable clash of the classes was the key to unlocking human history. So, and then everybody begins to pile on these beliefs. You mentioned the eugenicists and other types of racialist thinkers. And so there isn't one source of this, but kind of a witch's brew of these late 19th century ideas that then come into fruition. I was just reading one of the Nazis' top racial theorists, HFK Gunther, and his scientific approach to racism, I just thought I'd throw this out. He felt that American laws in the South were too severe because one drop put you over the top in the South. And so I find it interesting that the top Nazi racial theorist considered U.S. racial attitudes as too extravagant. But the point is, this is where you get this, and for Hitler, he states in Mein Kampf that at a certain pivotal point in his life, his political worldview became set in stone, and he never deviated from these beliefs. So if we take what he wrote, he was always consistent, and his recurring message was that the Jews were the enemy of all peoples of the world, and the Germans in particular, and that this animated his entire worldview.
I'll just, if I can add one quick point. I'm so glad that you answered that question because you did it so much better than I could. This got the racial anti-Semitism got layered on top, of course, of the long-standing religious anti-Semitism that had existed since the Middle Ages or longer, where Christians believed that the Jews had killed.
All of these different ideas, and they're all referenced by Nazi quote, thinkers, end quote, like Julius Streicher and the SS Ahnenerbe and other groups. They'll use anything to propagate this hatred of the Jews. And so depending on where you look in Nazi literature, if you choose to spend your time that way, you'll find numerous references both to biological racialism and, of course, the traditional anti-Semitism, even though it must be said that SS certainly were as anti-Catholic as they were as well.
One area that seems to be overlooked in a lot of literature out there is how was the whole buildup and the effort of the war when you consider
starting in 1932 or whatever, what condition Germany was in, there was a tremendous amount of financing and economics that had to go into this effort. But we hear very little about how they actually pulled that off.
And here I'm going to simply recommend a very good book, Adam Tooze, T-O-O-Z-E, The Wages of Destruction. It's an economic history of the Third Reich. Now, I know for my part, when I see the words economic history, my eyes tend to roll back into my head, and because I don't understand this stuff. Tooze makes it clear, and he also really understands the other elements involved. He understands Nazi ideology, he understands military strategy. He puts it all together into a very coherent package, and it really taught me a lot about German strategy. Anybody who wants to know about how the Germans built up for the war and how they ran the war economically, I recommend that book.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.